At 78 years old, I thought I had buried all my secrets 6 feet under with my brother Bobby. For 4 decades, I raised his twins as my own, protected them from a truth so horrific it would have shattered their innocent hearts. But last Tuesday, David and Sarah walked into my kitchen carrying a weathered cardboard box that made my blood turn to ice. Inside were photographs, journals, and souvenirs that proved Bobby Thompson wasn't the golden boy who died tragically young. He was a monster who stalked the back roads of Ohio, and I had spent 40 years lying to everyone, including myself, about what I knew. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of my modest colonial on Maple Street as I prepared what I thought would be just another ordinary Tuesday dinner. The scent of pot roast filled my kitchen, the same recipe I'd been making for 40 years, ever since 2 frightened toddlers became my whole world overnight. I had set 3 places at my worn oak table, the same table where David and Sarah had done their homework, where we'd celebrated birthdays, where we'd weathered every storm life had thrown at us. I was humming an old hymn when I heard their car doors slam in unison, that synchronized sound that had marked their arrival since they were old enough to visit on their own. David pushed through my front door first, his press badge still clipped to his jacket from whatever story had consumed his day at the Columbus Tribune. At 42, he had Bobby's height and my father's steady brown eyes, though his hair had started showing silver at the temples. Behind him came Sarah, still in her courtroom armor of navy blazer and pearls, her briefcase clutched tightly in one hand. She had always been the more intense twin, the one who questioned everything, who never let sleeping dogs lie. They had driven separately from their respective cities, which should have been my first warning that this wasn't a casual family dinner. What struck me immediately was their faces. These weren't the warm, familiar expressions of my beloved niece and nephew coming home for comfort food and easy conversation. Their eyes held something I hadn't seen since they were children waking from nightmares, something dark and troubled that made my maternal instincts flare to life. David's usual easy smile was nowhere to be found, and Sarah's mouth was set in that thin line she wore when she was about to cross-examine a hostile witness. "Aunt Maggie," David said, his voice carrying an odd formality that made me pause in wiping my hands on my apron. "We need to talk." I gestured toward the dining room, where I'd already laid out my best china, the floral pattern my mother had given me when I'd first moved into this house. "Of course, honey. Dinner's almost ready. How was the drive from Columbus? Sarah, did you come straight from court?" But they didn't move toward the dining room. Instead, they remained standing in my kitchen, creating an invisible barrier between themselves and the warmth I was trying to offer. Sarah set her briefcase on my counter with deliberate care, the kind of precision she used when presenting evidence. David reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope, thick with contents that made it bulge ominously. "This isn't about dinner," Sarah said quietly, her attorney voice replacing the affectionate tone she'd used since childhood. "This is about Dad." The word Dad hit me like a physical blow. They had never called Bobby Dad growing up. To them, he had always been the mythical figure from family stories, the uncle who had died too young, the tragic hero whose memory we honored but never dwelled upon. They called me Aunt Maggie out of habit, but I was the only parent they had ever known. Hearing Sarah refer to Bobby as their father, with such weight and meaning, told me that whatever they had discovered had fundamentally shifted their understanding of their identity. "Sit down, Aunt Maggie," David said gently, pulling out one of my kitchen chairs. His journalist's instincts were kicking in, I could tell. He was managing the situation, controlling the flow of information, preparing to deliver news that he knew would devastate me. "Please." I remained standing, my hands still twisted in my apron, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. "What about your father? Bobby's been gone for 40 years, kids." "What could there possibly be to discuss?" Sarah opened her briefcase with clinical precision and withdrew a familiar object that made my knees nearly buckle. It was Bobby's old Polaroid camera, the one I thought I had destroyed decades ago. The brown leather case was cracked with age, and the metal showed rust spots, but it was unmistakably his. I could still see him holding it at family gatherings, insisting on taking pictures when the rest of us just wanted to enjoy the moment. "We found this," Sarah said, placing it on my kitchen counter like evidence in a trial, along with some other things in the basement of the old farmhouse. The old Thompson family farm. I hadn't been out there in 15 years, not since the county had condemned the main house and the property had reverted to wilderness. My father had bought those 100 acres back in 1952, and Bobby had inherited them when Dad passed in 1981. After Bobby died, I couldn't bear to deal with the property, couldn't face the memories that clung to every fence post and outbuilding. I had simply let it sit, paying the minimal taxes each year, telling myself I'd figure out what to do with it someday. "You went to the farm?" I asked, though I could already see the truth in their faces. "Why would you go out there? The house isn't safe." David pulled out his phone and showed me a photograph that made my breath catch. It was the farmhouse basement, but not as I remembered it. Someone had cleared away decades of accumulated junk, revealing the stone foundation walls I hadn't seen since I was a child. And there, tucked into a corner behind the old furnace, was a wooden crate that I recognized with horrible clarity. "The Historical Society contacted us last month," David explained, his journalist's objectivity warring with something more personal in his voice. "The county is planning to sell the land for development, and they wanted to do an archaeological survey first. They needed permission from the family, and since we're Bobby's only living relatives besides you, they reached out to us." I sank into the chair David had pulled out for me, my legs no longer capable of supporting my weight. The Historical Society. Of course. Millbrook had been trying to capitalize on its heritage for years, hoping to attract tourists and reverse the economic decline that had been slowly strangling the town since the automotive plant closed. They would have been thorough, professional, determined to document every aspect of the old farmstead before bulldozers arrived. "We went out there with them," Sarah continued, her attorney's training keeping her voice steady even as her hands trembled slightly, "just to make sure they treated the property with respect. We thought we might find some family heirlooms, maybe some photos or documents that would help us understand our history better." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She paused, and I could see her struggling with how to continue. This was Sarah, who had never backed down from a difficult conversation in her life, who could reduce hostile witnesses to tears with her relentless pursuit of truth. But now she looked like the lost little girl I had tucked into bed thousands of times. The child who had cried for parents she couldn't remember. "We found more than family history, Aunt Maggie," she whispered. David opened the manila envelope and withdrew a stack of photographs, but he held them face down, protecting me from their contents for just a moment longer. The Historical Society left us alone to go through the basement. They were documenting the main floor. We were being careful, respectful, just looking for anything that might be worth saving before the demolition. I could picture them so clearly, my twins working together as they always had, David's methodical approach complementing Sarah's intuitive leaps. They would have sorted through the detritus of decades with the same care they brought to everything, talking quietly about memories of their few visits to the farmhouse as children, back when I still thought it might be good for them to connect with their father's legacy. "The crate was hidden behind loose stones," Sarah said. "It looked like someone had deliberately concealed it, maybe planning to come back for it later. When we opened it," she gestured to David, who slowly turned over the first photograph. It was a Polaroid, faded with age, but still devastatingly clear. A young woman, maybe 19 or 20, with dark hair and frightened eyes. She was sitting in what looked like the farmhouse basement, and even across the decades, even in the uncertain light of the photograph, I could see the terror written across her features. My hands flew to my mouth, but I couldn't stifle the sound that escaped, a keening wail that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than my lungs. Because I recognized her. Not personally, but from the newspaper clippings I had obsessively collected and hidden away 40 years ago. Jennifer Martinez, missing from Toledo in September 1983, 20 years old, last seen leaving her job at a diner on the interstate. Her disappearance had made statewide news for 3 days, before other tragedies pushed her from the headlines. "There are more," David said quietly, his reporter's instincts warring with his love for me. 12 photographs total. Different women, different locations, but all taken with this camera. All showing. He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. I could see it in their faces, in the way they held themselves, in the careful distance they were maintaining from me. They had found evidence that their father was a killer, and they had spent weeks processing this information, deciding how to confront me, wondering what I might have known. Sarah reached into the crate, which I now saw they had brought with them, and withdrew a leather-bound journal. The cover was worn smooth, the pages yellowed with age, but I recognized Bobby's handwriting on the first page she opened. His distinctive chicken scratch, the same writing that had adorned birthday cards and Christmas lists throughout our childhood. "He wrote about them," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About what he did to them, about how it made him feel. It's all here, Aunt Maggie. Everything." The journal trembled in her hands as she turned pages, and I caught glimpses of Bobby's words, rambling passages about power and control, and the thrill of being in complete command of another person's life. He had written about the hunt, about selecting his victims, about the careful planning that went into each abduction. But more than that, he had written about the aftermath, about how he felt invincible, untouchable, chosen for something greater than the mundane existence of ordinary people. "The last entry is dated 3 days before the car accident," David said, consulting his phone where he had apparently photographed the relevant pages. He was planning another one. He had already chosen her, already started following her routine. A college student from Ohio State who worked weekends at her family's restaurant in Millbrook. I closed my eyes, remembering that weekend 40 years ago. Bobby had been acting strange, more agitated than usual, disappearing for hours at a time without explanation. He had been staying at the farmhouse instead of his apartment in town, claiming he needed space to think about his future. I had attributed his mood to the stress of his construction business, which had been struggling in the recession. I had been worried about him, concerned about his drinking and his increasingly erratic behavior. The car accident had happened on a Sunday night in November. Bobby had been driving too fast on a winding country road, lost control on a patch of black ice, and wrapped his truck around an oak tree. He had died instantly, according to the coroner, and I had grieved him as a troubled young man who had died before he could find his way back to the light. The police never connected him to the disappearances, Sarah said, her legal mind already working through the implications. The women vanished from different jurisdictions, different counties. This was before computers, before databases that could link cases across state lines. And after he died, the disappearances stopped, so there was no pattern for investigators to follow. I opened my eyes and looked at my twins, these two remarkable people who had grown up believing their father was a tragic figure cut down in his prime. David had chosen journalism partly because he wanted to tell stories that mattered, to give voice to the voiceless. Sarah had become a defense attorney because she believed everyone deserved a fair trial, a chance at redemption. They had built their moral foundations on the myth of Bobby Thompson, the young man who had worked hard, loved his family, and died too soon. "How long have you known?" David asked quietly, and I could hear the question behind the question. How long had I lied to them? How long had I protected a killer's reputation, while his victims remained nameless and forgotten? I wanted to deny everything, to claim ignorance, to maintain the fiction that had protected them for 4 decades. But the evidence was spread across my kitchen table, irrefutable and damning. And more than that, they deserved the truth, no matter how painful it might be for all of us. "I found the first photographs 2 weeks after the funeral," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. I was cleaning out his apartment, sorting through his things before the landlord needed the place back. They were hidden in a shoebox in his closet, along with newspaper clippings about missing women and a road atlas with routes marked in red ink. The words came slowly, like drawing water from a poisoned well. I had never spoken them aloud, had never allowed myself to fully confront what I had discovered in Bobby's apartment that cold December day. I had been 28 years old myself, unmarried, working as a substitute teacher, suddenly responsible for 2 toddlers who had already lost their mother to cancer, and now their father to what everyone believed was a tragic accident. "I burned them," I continued, unable to meet their eyes. I took everything back to the farmhouse and burned it in the old barrel behind the barn. I told myself I was protecting his memory, protecting you two from growing up with the stigma of being a killer's children. But I was also protecting myself, protecting our family's reputation in this town. Sarah leaned forward, her cross-examination instincts taking over. But you didn't burn everything, did you? You kept something. I nodded, feeling the weight of 40 years of secrets pressing down on my shoulders. I kept one photograph and one page from a journal I found. I told myself it was insurance, evidence in case the police ever came asking questions. But really, I think I kept them because I couldn't quite bring myself to believe what I was seeing. I needed proof that it was real, that the brother I had loved and protected was capable of such evil. Where are they? David asked, though his expression told me he already suspected the answer. Upstairs, I whispered. Hidden in my bedroom, in a place I thought no one would ever look. The three of us sat in silence for a moment, the magnitude of the revelations settling around us like fog. 40 years of lies, 40 years of carefully constructed mythology, 40 years of protecting a reputation that should have been destroyed decades ago. And now my twins, these beautiful people who had built their lives on a foundation of deceit, were left to reckon with the truth about their father and about me. The families, Sarah said suddenly, her lawyer's mind jumping to the practical implications. The victims' families, they never had closure. They never knew what happened to their daughters, their sisters. I thought about all those years of reading the newspaper, watching for any mention of the missing women, wondering if their families still hoped they might come home someday. I had told myself that my silence was protecting David and Sarah, but it had also condemned those families to a lifetime of uncertainty and grief. We have to tell them, David said, his journalist's ethics warring with his love for our family. We have to give the evidence to the police. Let them reopen the investigations. These women deserve justice, even if it's 40 years too late. I looked at these two remarkable people I had raised, watching them grapple with an impossible situation that would define the rest of their lives. They could have hidden this discovery, could have reburied the evidence and lived with the secret as I had done. But that wasn't who they were. I had raised them to believe in truth and justice, and now those values were demanding a price I wasn't sure any of us could pay. I know, I said finally, my voice barely a whisper. I know we have to tell them. I've known for 40 years, and I've been a coward every single day since. The pot roast continued to fill my kitchen with its familiar aroma, a mockery of normalcy in a moment that had shattered everything we thought we knew about ourselves. Outside, the autumn rain kept falling, washing away the last remnants of a lie that had protected us all for far too long. The silence that followed my confession stretched between us like a chasm 40 years wide. David pushed back from the kitchen table, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor with a sound that seemed too loud in the sudden quiet. Sarah remained perfectly still, her hands flat on the table's surface, staring at the evidence of her father's crimes, as if she could will it all to disappear through sheer force of concentration. I rose slowly, my joints protesting after decades of carrying this unbearable weight, and walked to the kitchen window. The rain had intensified, turning Maple Street into a river of memories. I could see Mrs. Chen's house across the way, her porch light glowing yellow in the gathering darkness. Helen had been my closest friend for 35 years, had helped me raise these children, had never once questioned the story I told about Bobby's tragic accident. How many people would I hurt when the truth finally came to light? Show us, Sarah said suddenly, her voice cutting through my reverie. When I turned back to face them, she was standing, her courtroom composure firmly in place, despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Show us what you kept. David looked at his sister with something approaching alarm. Sarah, maybe we should process what we already know before. No, she interrupted, using the tone that had intimidated countless opposing counsel. We're here for the truth, David. All of it. We can't make decisions about what to do next until we understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. I nodded, understanding her logic even as my heart broke for what this would do to her. Sarah had always been the one who needed to see everything, to examine every piece of evidence, to build her cases on absolute certainty rather than reasonable doubt. It was what made her an exceptional attorney, but it was also what would make this revelation particularly devastating for her. "Wait here," I said, though I knew they would follow me anyway. The twins had never been good at staying put when important family business was being conducted elsewhere in the house. My bedroom was at the top of the narrow stairs, the same room I had occupied since moving into this house at 25. The walls were still painted the soft blue I had chosen decades ago, and the furniture was the same oak set my parents had given me as a housewarming gift. It was a room frozen in time, much like the secret I had kept hidden within its walls. The twins stood in my doorway as I knelt beside my dresser, their presence both comforting and accusatory. I could feel their eyes on me as I reached behind the heavy piece of furniture, my fingers searching for the small wooden box I had wedged into the narrow space between the dresser and the wall. My arthritis made the movement painful, but the box was exactly where I had left it 4 decades ago, wrapped in an old pillowcase and secured with a rubber band that had long since lost its elasticity. I sat on the edge of my bed, the box heavy in my hands despite its small size. Inside were the 2 pieces of evidence I had been unable to destroy, the proof that had haunted my dreams and shaped every decision I had made since Bobby's death. David and Sarah approached slowly, as if they were walking toward an explosive device that might detonate at any moment. "This is Jennifer Martinez," I said, withdrawing the faded Polaroid with hands that trembled despite my efforts to remain steady. "She was the first one I found evidence of, though I suspect now that she wasn't his first victim." Bobby had written her name on the back, along with a date and location. The photograph was even more horrifying than I remembered. Jennifer's eyes held a terror so profound it seemed to leap from the yellowed paper, and behind her, I could make out details of the farmhouse basement that I had tried for decades to forget. The old wooden shelves, the stone foundation, the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Bobby had kept her there for days before killing her, according to the journal entries I had found. Sarah took the photograph from my hands with the careful precision she used when handling crucial evidence in court. She studied it for a long moment, her professional objectivity warring with the personal devastation written across her features. "The basement where we found the crate," she said quietly. "She was held in the same place where he hid the evidence." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. David moved to his sister's side, looking over her shoulder at the image that had tormented my conscience for 40 years. His journalist's eye was already cataloging details I could tell, building the story that would eventually need to be told to the world. "What else?" he asked, though his voice suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know. I withdrew the single journal page I had kept, the paper yellowed and brittle with age. Bobby's handwriting sprawled across the lines, describing Jennifer's final hours with a clinical detachment that still made my stomach turn after all these years. He had written about her fear, about the power he felt in controlling another person's fate, about the rush of adrenaline that came with playing God. Sarah read the page twice, her legal training allowing her to absorb even the most disturbing details with professional detachment. But I could see the cost of that composure in the rigid set of her shoulders, in the way her hands shook almost imperceptibly as she set the paper aside. "This isn't just evidence of murder," she said finally, her voice hollow. "This is evidence of torture, of prolonged psychological torment. He didn't just kill these women, Aunt Maggie. He kept them alive long enough to break their spirits completely." The clinical assessment hit me like a physical blow. I had read that journal page countless times over the decades, but hearing Sarah articulate the full horror of what Bobby had done stripped away the protective numbness I had built around the truth. These weren't quick deaths, crimes of passion or opportunity. They were calculated acts of sadism by someone who derived pleasure from the suffering of innocent people. David was pacing now, his reporter's instincts battling with his emotional turmoil. "We need to contact Detective Martinez," he said, referring to the retired officer who had originally investigated some of the disappearances. "He's still alive, still living in Toledo. I've been in touch with him over the years for various stories. He never stopped wondering about those cases." "Frank Martinez," I said quietly, surprising them both. "Jennifer's uncle. He became a police officer because of what happened to her." They stared at me, and I could see the questions forming in their minds, How much more did I know? How deep did my complicity go? How many other secrets had I kept? I followed the investigations, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Not closely, but I kept track of the families, the officers involved, the cold case reviews over the years. I told myself I was being vigilant, making sure no one ever connected Bobby to the crimes, but really I think I was punishing myself, forcing myself to live with the knowledge of what I had done by staying silent. Sarah sat heavily in my old rocking chair, the same chair where I had nursed them through countless childhood illnesses, where I had read them bedtime stories and helped them with homework. Now she looked small and lost, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what we were facing. The statute of limitations doesn't apply to murder, she said, though we all knew Bobby was beyond the reach of earthly justice. But there might be other legal implications. Obstruction of justice. Accessory after the fact. The authorities might argue that by destroying evidence and remaining silent, you helped him evade capture. I had considered these possibilities many times over the years, had imagined scenarios where my role in covering up Bobby's crimes came to light. But the fear of legal consequences had always been secondary to my terror of what the truth would do to David and Sarah. They had been so young, so innocent, and I had convinced myself that protecting them justified any personal risk I might face. I don't care about that, I said, and I meant it. I'm 78 years old. Whatever consequences I face, I can handle them. But those families deserve to know what happened to their daughters. They deserve to bury their children and find some measure of peace. David stopped pacing and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You've been carrying this alone for 40 years, he said, and there was a note of wonder in his voice as if he was just beginning to understand the full weight of what I had endured. All those times we asked about our father, all those family stories you told us, all those visits to his grave. You are protecting us from the truth every single day. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. The visits to Pine Ridge Cemetery had been the hardest part, standing beside Bobby's headstone with two innocent children who wanted to leave flowers for the father they couldn't remember. I had watched them grow up believing they were the children of a good man taken too soon, had listened to them speak with pride about their father's construction business and his reputation in the community. We need to make a plan, Sarah said, her legal mind taking control of a situation that threatened to overwhelm us all emotionally. This can't be handled carelessly. There are victims' families to consider, law enforcement agencies that will need to coordinate, media attention that will be impossible to avoid once the story breaks. She was right, of course. The revelation that a serial killer had operated in rural Ohio for years without detection would generate significant news coverage. David's colleagues in journalism would pounce on the story, and our family would find itself at the center of a media storm that would reshape how we were seen in this small community where we had lived our entire lives. I've been thinking about this ever since we found the evidence, David admitted. As a journalist, I understand the public's right to know. But as your nephew, as someone who loves you more than anyone else in the world, I'm terrified of what this will do to you. I reached for his hand, surprised by how much it resembled Bobby's at the same age. The same long fingers, the same calluses from manual work, but without the darkness that had consumed my brother's soul. David had used his hands to build stories that helped people, to seek truth and justice through his reporting. The contrast was both heartbreaking and hopeful. Your father made his choices, I said firmly. I made mine by staying silent. Now you two have to make yours. And I want you to make them based on what's right, not on what's easiest for me. Sarah stood and walked to my bedroom window, looking out at the town where we had all grown up, where Bobby's victims had once walked and laughed and dreamed of futures they would never see. There's something else we need to consider, she said without turning around. The evidence we found suggests that Bobby was escalating. The journal entries show increasing violence, more elaborate fantasies. If he hadn't died in that accident, if he had continued. She didn't need to finish the thought. We all understood the implications. Bobby's death had likely saved lives, had prevented other families from experiencing the devastation that still rippled through the lives of his victims' loved ones. But that knowledge brought no comfort, only a deeper understanding of the randomness of tragedy and the thin line between survival and destruction. Detective Martinez needs to see this, David said, his decision made. All of it. The photographs, the journals, the evidence we found at the farmhouse. He spent 40 years wondering what happened to his niece, and he deserves to know the truth. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of 4 decades of secrets finally beginning to lift from my shoulders. The relief was overwhelming, but it was tinged with a terror that threatened to consume me. Once we made this call, once we set these wheels in motion, there would be no going back. Our family's story would be rewritten, our place in this community forever changed. There's something else, I said, my voice so quiet they had to lean in to hear me. Something I've never told anyone, not even myself most of the time. They waited, and I could see them bracing for another revelation, another layer of horror to add to what they had already discovered. The night before Bobby died, I continued, forcing myself to remember details I had spent 40 years trying to forget. He called me. He was drunk, rambling about how he was different from other people, how he had been chosen for something special. He said he was going to do something that would make him famous, something that would show everyone how powerful he really was. Sarah turned from the window, her face pale in the gathering darkness. What did you think he meant? I thought he was talking about his business, about some big construction contract he was hoping to land. Bobby was always grandiose when he drank, always convinced he was destined for greatness. But now, knowing what I know, I paused, struggling to voice the suspicion that had haunted me for decades. I think he was planning something bigger than individual murders. Something public, something that would terrorize the entire community. The car accident might not have just saved future victims. It might have prevented a massacre. The room fell silent again, all of us contemplating the possibility that Bobby's death had interrupted plans for even greater atrocities. It was a chilling thought, but it also reinforced our decision to come forward with the truth. If there were other potential victims out there, other families who had been spared because of Bobby's unexpected death, they deserved to know how close they had come to tragedy. David pulled out his phone, and I could see him scrolling through his contacts until he found Detective Martinez's number. His finger hovered over the call button, and I knew he was giving me one last chance to change my mind, to ask him to bury the evidence as I had done 40 years ago. Make the call, I said, my voice stronger than I had expected. It's time. As David dialed the number, Sarah came to sit beside me on the bed, taking my hand in hers with a gentleness that reminded me of all the times I had comforted her as a child. Whatever happens next, she said softly, we'll face it together. You're not alone anymore, Aunt Maggie. You don't have to carry this by yourself. I squeezed her hand, grateful beyond words for these 2 remarkable people who had somehow grown up to be everything good and decent, despite being raised in the shadow of such darkness. They were Bobby's children by blood, but they were mine by choice, by love, by the thousands of small decisions I had made to nurture their better angels, rather than the demons that might have claimed them. Detective Martinez answered on the 3rd ring, his voice still strong despite his advanced years. David identified himself and explained that he had information about some cold cases from the 1980s, specifically the disappearances of several young women in the Ohio area. There was a long pause, and then Martinez asked a question that made David's eyes widen. Yes, David said, glancing at me. Yes, we're related to Robert Thompson. He was our father. Another pause, longer this time. Then Martinez said something that made David sit down heavily, his face draining of color. What? Sarah demanded. What did he say? David covered the phone with his hand. He said they always suspected Bobby was involved, but they could never prove it. After Bobby died, the disappearances stopped, and they figured their prime suspect was dead. He's been waiting 40 years for someone to come forward with evidence. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with David providing basic details about our discovery and arranging to meet with Martinez the following day. When he finally hung up, the 3 of us sat in silence, processing the reality that our lives had just changed forever. He's going to contact the FBI, David said. Cases that cross state lines, potential serial killer. They'll want to coordinate with multiple agencies. This is going to be bigger than we thought. I nodded, having expected as much. The investigation would be thorough, professional, and very public. Our family would be scrutinized, our choices questioned, our motives examined. But for the first time in 40 years, I felt something approaching peace. The families, I said. I want to speak to the families personally, before this becomes a media circus. They deserve to hear the truth from someone who knew Bobby, someone who can answer their questions about who he was and why he did what he did. Sarah squeezed my hand again. We'll do it together, she said. All of it. The police interviews, the family meetings, whatever comes next. You raised us to do the right thing, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. As we made our way back downstairs, the pot roast long since forgotten, I thought about the 12 women whose faces stared out from the photographs we had spread across my kitchen table. Jennifer Martinez, whose uncle had spent his career seeking justice for her. The college student whose life Bobby had been planning to end before his own death intervened. 10 others whose names I would learn, whose stories I would help tell, whose families I would face with the truth they had waited decades to hear. The rain had stopped while we were upstairs, and through my kitchen window, I could see stars beginning to appear in the clearing sky. Tomorrow would bring Detective Martinez, FBI agents, reporters, and a reckoning 40 years in the making. But tonight, for the first time since Bobby's death, I wasn't carrying the weight of his crimes alone. David and Sarah helped me clean up the untouched dinner, working together with the easy efficiency that had marked our family dynamic for 4 decades. We talked quietly about practical matters, about which attorney Sarah would recommend to represent me, about how David would handle the inevitable media attention, about what we would tell the neighbors and friends who had known us as the Thompsons who had overcome tragedy through love and determination. As they prepared to leave, promising to return first thing in the morning to accompany me to the police station, Sarah paused at my front door. "Aunt Maggie," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "What you did, keeping this secret to protect us, it was an impossible choice. I don't know if it was right or wrong, but I understand why you made it. And I want you to know that nothing we've learned today changes how much we love you." David nodded in agreement, wrapping me in a hug that felt like forgiveness and understanding, and the promise of continued family despite everything that was about to change. After they left, I sat in my living room for a long time, looking at the family photographs that covered every available surface. Pictures of David's high school graduation, Sarah's law school ceremony, countless birthdays and holidays and ordinary moments that had made up our life together. Tomorrow, the world would learn that these beautiful people were the children of a monster. But they would also see the truth that mattered most. Love had triumphed over genetics. Nurture had overcome nature. And goodness had found a way to flourish even in the shadow of unimaginable evil. I thought about Bobby, about the brother I had loved and mourned and protected for 40 years. I thought about the choices that had led him down a path of darkness, about the signs I might have missed, about whether anything could have saved him from becoming what he became. But mostly I thought about Jennifer Martinez and the 11 other women whose lives had been cut short by his actions. And I felt grateful that tomorrow, finally, their families would have answers. The truth would be painful for everyone involved, but it would also be liberating. For the first time in 4 decades, I would go to sleep without the weight of Robert Thompson's crimes pressing down on my chest. His victims would finally have justice, their families would finally have closure, and David and Sarah would finally understand the full truth about their heritage and the woman who had raised them. It wouldn't be easy. The coming weeks and months would test us all in ways we couldn't yet imagine. But we would face it together, as a family built not on blood or shared genetics, but on love and choice, and the unwavering commitment to do what was right, no matter the personal cost. As I finally made my way upstairs to bed, I whispered a prayer for Jennifer Martinez and all the others, a promise that their stories would finally be told, their names finally remembered, their families finally given the peace they had been denied for far too long. The secret that had shaped my life for 40 years was finally coming to an end, and with it, a new chapter was about to begin. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.